everyone. So today we're going to learn about the Enlightenment, which is an intellectual movement that led to a lot of revolutions we're going to study soon. So the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement that began in 18th century Europe in the 1700s. The primary people in the Enlightenment are called philosophes, which is the French word for philosopher. And a lot of these discussions took place in salons, which are like the living room of a wealthy person at the time. The unofficial headquarters of the Enlightenment was in Paris, although we have Enlightenment thinkers from all over Europe. And the Enlightenment thinkers were greatly impressed by the achievements of the scientific revolution that came before them. So people like Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes were coming up with these new ideas. So like Isaac Newton came up with the universal laws of gravitation. Rene Descartes was a philosopher that really emphasized reason and rational thinking as a way of arriving at knowledge. And Francis Bacon was instrumental in developing the scientific method. Before this, people tended to rely on the church or ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle for their information, rather than actually using science and reasoning. And so once these scientists started to do those things, the philosophers of the Enlightenment really wanted to apply all of that to society. So they wanted to take scientific principles like those that they thought people like Isaac Newton were using and try to apply them to all parts of society, like government, the economy, etc. One of the things that allowed women to somewhat participate in the Enlightenment is the fact that it was held in private homes. So this is a typical picture of a salon, which again is the living room of a wealthy person's home. A lot of these Enlightenment discussions took place like this, kind of behind closed doors. And because a woman's role at the time was considered in the home, there are a lot of examples of women who held or even participated in salon discussions. And in this painting, if you look closely, we can see several women right here, right here, right here, right here, right here, right here, right here. So women hosted these and sometimes even participated. Ideas during the Enlightenment spread through salon discussions, like we just saw, also through coffee houses. So think like Starbucks, people will just go and hang out and talk. That's kind of the idea. So coffee and tea became all the rage in Europe. We think of tea as being, I think, like a very, something like the English were always doing. But it's really not until we have the discovery of the Americas and global trade that coffee and tea really take off. Because coffee and tea are native to Afro-Eurasia, but until Europeans introduced sugar, and we know about sugar being grown in the Americas, that's what really led this to take off. And so coffee houses were another place where people would get together and share ideas. And then the printing press was huge as well that we learned about. So printing books, magazines, newspapers, pamphlets. Now, if someone wrote a book, one of these philosophers, it could be easily shared and those ideas could be shared. All right, so John Locke is a little bit before the Enlightenment, but he's very influential in the revolutions that we're going to study. He heavily influenced the Enlightenment thinkers that we're going to talk about. One of his major ideas was natural rights. Natural rights were supposed to be, according to John Locke, God-given rights that because they're God-given, everyone has them and they can't be taken away by anyone. And John Locke said that these rights are life, liberty, and property. John Locke also believed in a social contract that the government must protect natural rights and people must obey the government. So if you think about a contract, both sides of the contract always have like obligations. So what John Locke is saying is that people have a contract with their government. And it's the people's job to obey the laws of the government, but then the government has to protect people's rights. So it like goes both ways. And so if the government isn't protecting people's rights, then they would have the right to rebel against their government and establish one that is going to protect their rights. And so think about that in our society. Like we have rights that are listed in our Constitution and Bill of Rights that our government has to respect, but also our government is allowed to pass laws and put restrictions on us as long as they don't interfere with those rights. So that's kind of what he's talking about. Another important philosopher is Voltaire, who was French. He was known really for challenging the Catholic Church and deism. So let me explain a little bit about deism. A lot of these philosophers, they believed in a God, but not really fully in Christianity like most people would think of it today. And deism is an example of that. Deists believe that there was a God or a divine being that created the universe, but that it is mechanical and scientific and it just kind of runs on its own. And so God doesn't interfere in people's daily lives because the universe just runs on its own. So they believe in like an intelligent creator or some being created the world, but that it just runs on its own. A lot of people refer to this as God as a clockmaker, which I know we don't wind up clocks anymore. But if you picture an old-timey clock that you have to wind, you wind it up and then it just goes tick, 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 and it just runs on its own. That's how they view the universe. Voltaire was also a big proponent of religious toleration. And we have to remember that Voltaire was French, and France was under an absolutist ruler at the time who forced everyone to be Catholic. And so when he's saying religious toleration, he's saying that there shouldn't just be one state religion, other forms of religion, maybe not all forms of religion like we have today, but at least other forms of Christianity should be allowed. He also was a big proponent of freedom of speech. So here's a famous quote from him: "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." And again, he's coming from France where they had an absolute monarchy and the people definitely did not have freedom of speech. I also want to draw your attention to the quote at the top. This is something that is important to understand about all these Enlightenment thinkers, because when we start talking about them, it can be easy to assume that they want just total democracy, freedom for everybody, like we are pushing, we hope we have in America and are at least working on having in America. That's not what they are proposing. So here's a quote at the top: "Human beings are very rarely worthy to govern themselves." So most of these guys were upper class white men living in Europe. That's who they thought should be in charge. So a lot of them don't like absolute monarchy, but they don't think just everybody in society should be able to participate. So that's just an important thing to keep in mind that can be misconstrued as we study these people. Voltaire's also just really known for his sarcasm and satire. So I'll give you a second to read some of these quotes from him. The next Enlightenment philosopher is Baron de Montesquieu, who's French. He wrote several books, but the one that's important for us is called The Spirit of Laws. And what he did was he tried to study governments throughout the world and categorize them. And he came up with three major types: republic, which is no king, monarchy, and despotism. And for him, despotism is another word for absolute ruler. So he thought, England has a monarchy, but their monarchy has some limits, whereas France had an absolute monarchy. And so he sees England's system as a really good system that he admired. Now, two really influential ideas from this book that are important are separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers is when the government is divided into branches and each branch has its own responsibilities. So in the United States Constitution, for example, we have the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. And the Constitution lays out, here are all the responsibilities of the executive branch. Here's all the responsibilities of the legislative branch. And so power is divided between different parts of the government. With that goes checks and balances, which is also part of the United States Constitution. So, for example, one branch cannot have too much power over the other. They have a check on each other. So, Congress can check the president because Congress has to approve some of the people that the president appoints, like Supreme Court justices or his cabinet members. The president also has a check on Congress because they pass legislation and he has to sign it or he can veto it. So that's checks and balances. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is French, and he also wrote a book called The Social Contract. His is similar, but a little bit different from John Locke. So he said that people should be governed by the general will, meaning what the majority of people decide we should do is what people should be forced to go along with, and that people should be actively involved in deciding on the laws. So he really wanted more of a direct democracy. And you can probably think of examples like that in our society where there are laws that not everybody agrees with, but we have to go along with what the general will or the majority has decided is what we're going to live by. The next one is Cesare Beccaria, who's Italian, and he wrote on crimes and punishments. He is very influential in criminal justice. One of the things that we have to understand, because as we look at his principles here, they're going to seem like very familiar to us. But in his time period, these things were pretty foreign. In his time period, people could have the death penalty for a ton of different crimes. Like in some countries, 20, 30 crimes have the death penalty, whereas in America today, it's very, very few. Also, torture, cruel and unusual punishment was used widely. In his day, most people, if they're accused of a crime and didn't confess, they'd be tortured until they did confess. Okay, so that's the environment that he's coming from in proposing these things. So he said punishment should only be harsh enough to serve as a deterrent. We shouldn't have really, really harsh punishments for more minor crimes. He opposed capital punishment. He said it didn't deter people from committing crimes, and that imprisonment was a better punishment for people. He was against torture and cruel and unusual punishment, and he said people should be equal in their punishment that they receive regardless of their social class. So higher social classes shouldn't have a lower punishment. Lower social classes shouldn't have a harsher punishment just because of their status in society. And so this very heavily influenced the development of the USA. And a lot of these things are in the United States Bill of Rights. Adam Smith wrote a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations, and he's writing about economics. He believed in free trade, not mercantilism. So again, today you hear about free trade all the time, but in his day, that was not what they were doing. Remember, with mercantilism, European countries wanted to very tightly control the economies of their nations, including their colonies. So an easy example, remember the 13 colonies under Great Britain? They were not allowed to trade with anyone else but Great Britain. And so what Adam Smith is advocating is that different countries, colonies, everybody should be able to freely trade throughout the world where they can get the best product and the best price. He also promoted laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire means let it be, or kind of like hands off, where he said the government should not be involved in the economy. And this is something, too, that is a reaction to his time period, because in mercantilism, the government is very involved in the economy. And so he's saying, no, the government should kind of let people run the economy on their own. And this is more like what we have. So you may be thinking, no, our government is still very involved in the economy. And that's true. But compared to in his time period, we're able to make our own decisions in our economy, like what we buy, what we sell, what the prices are. All of that, for the most part, is decided by individual people. He also promoted an idea called the invisible hand. The invisible hand is basically saying we should allow supply and demand to determine what prices are, how much is produced, all of that. It shouldn't be determined by the government. So, for example, a business, when it's determining how much to supply or how much to make, normally is going to look at, um, like how much people are buying, what are the trends. All of that is going to go into their decision making. And he's saying businesses should be able to do that on their own, not have the government set all that for them. That an economy is going to run best and be most successful when the government stays out of it. And so here's a quote from him that illustrates that. By pursuing his own self-interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. So what he's saying is, if people are able to make their own economic decisions, the economy is going to be successful more for everyone than if we try to tightly control everything. And then Mary Wollstonecraft is English. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she wrote a lot about women's rights. So here are some examples of some arguments that she proposed in her book. That the Enlightenment philosophers are very against the absolute power of monarchies. And therefore, if it's wrong for a king to have absolute power over his people, it's also wrong for men to have absolute power over women. Another argument is she said the Enlightenment is all about rationalism and the ability to reason, and women have that ability. They just haven't been given the same education, the same opportunities. And so if they had those things, they would have the same intellectual ability as men, and they deserve equal rights in the society. So the impact of this is huge. We're going to continue studying and very soon learn about these events, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Latin American revolutions. You can probably already see how these people influenced the American Revolution, but we'll learn about how they influenced these others. It also contributed to a belief in reason and progress, just that society was continually moving forward and improving itself. It also led to a more secular outlook. Remember, secular means non-religious. Previously, Europeans were very reliant on religion to understand the world, and they still are in this time period, but we start having people propose all these new ideas that are separated from religion. And then it also led to a challenge of traditional ideas and more rights for people throughout the world. So we're going to see more people getting the right to vote, which is suffrage, slavery abolished in the Western world, the end of serfdom, less absolute monarchy. So the Enlightenment really challenged the way that people had been doing things for a long time, and it did definitely lead to changes in society.